An aging hitman, about to retire, had worked hard for many years and was just on the verge of securing a generous pension that would let him live the luxurious life he had always dreamed of. However, a pair of young hitmen silently surrounded him. As a sniper from afar squeezed the trigger, the bullet accurately hit the old hitman. At the same time, the assassins lurking nearby sprang into action, quickly shooting down the old hitman, who had tried to fight back. The old hitman recognized that the leader of the group was Hilda, a young assassin from the same company. Then, Hilda tossed a remark, "You're getting old," and shot the old hitman dead before leading her team to leave in a sturdy helicopter. The protagonist, Duncan, is a top-tier assassin in the industry. He, along with the old hitman who was just killed and Hilda, all belonged to the same assassin company. Duncan had executed countless assassination missions over the decades, never failing. He earned the nickname Black Kaiser, but with all these accolades came a body full of scars and deep, irreparable wounds. Duncan had long grown tired of this life. Fortunately, according to his employment contract, he only had 14 more days before retirement. After reviewing Duncan's assets, his accountant calculated that Duncan would receive a whopping $8.2 million in pension from the assassin company. Though Duncan had amassed a fortune from his years as a hitman, he had missed out on love and family, and aside from killing, Duncan had no other hobbies. Each year, Duncan transferred $200,000 to a charity organization to support an orphan, seeking some comfort for his blood-stained conscience. One day, his boss Vivian found him and told him that several assassins from the company had been killed recently. The old hitman, who was just murdered, was the fourth. After investigating, it was found that a Mexican hitman was responsible, and the mastermind behind it all was a Russian rival seeking revenge. Now, the boss had approved a plan for revenge, offering $1 million to kill the Mexican hitman, but Duncan didn't want any more trouble before his retirement. Besides, his money was already enough. He decisively rejected the job. Instead, he did not register the 4 properties listed by his accountant and went to a quiet, remote town, hoping to live peacefully there. Along the way, he bought a puppy, because after retirement, he figured he'd need something to do. He even bought a video on how to take care of dogs. Unfortunately for the dog, it met Duncan at the worst possible time. One night, Duncan fell asleep on the couch. The dog was licking something, and Duncan had a nightmare. Waking up startled, hearing some noise, he instinctively shot the dog, and it died on the spot. The next day, Duncan buried the dog and burned the dog care guide, only to see his neighbor Camille chopping wood across the street. Later, Duncan took advantage of Camille being out and chopped all the wood for her. When Camille came back and saw the neatly stacked firewood, she looked puzzled. Duncan noticed her expression and gave a slight smile, feeling as though he'd pulled off a small prank. At the same time, he was pleased that he was still of some use to someone. That night, Duncan received 15 encrypted messages from Vivian. Though he wanted to ignore them, he decided to check the messages, given their long working relationship. As expected, the messages were about the mission to kill the Mexican hitman. Vivian's boss insisted that Duncan take it, raising the payment to $2 million, $1 million as a deposit, with another $1 million to be paid once the job was done. Duncan didn't directly refuse but told Vivian to send the details first so he could decide. According to the files, the Mexican hitman was a large, overweight man currently in Belarus. Duncan decided to meet the man first before making any further decisions and did not inform Vivian. The boss's name was Blut, and the task Vivian and Blut gave Duncan was a trap, aimed at having Duncan killed in the mission and seizing his enormous pension. Vivian had mentioned that 4 soon-to-retire hitmen had been killed, but in reality, all of these killings were Blut's doing. The assassin company was founded by Blut's father, and after his father's death, Blut lacked the capability to run it. The company's condition worsened, and he planned to sell it. However, the company still had around $30 million in debt. To make the company more valuable for sale, Blut decided to kill the soon-to-retire hitman and seize their pension funds. According to the employment contract, if the assassins die during a mission or from an unspecified accident, their pensions go to the company unless they have signed a family inheritance agreement before death. But these hitmen had no direct relatives. Meanwhile, Duncan had arrived in Belarus. He contacted a woman he often worked with, asking her to bring her son and stay in the room next to the target, locked in a hotel. Then, he called the front desk, claiming the door lock was broken, and Duncan himself posed as the repairman. He made a lot of noise on purpose to attract the target, who stormed out to confront him. The target, furious, tried to deal with Duncan, but Duncan shot him with a nail gun, pinning him to the wall. Then, Duncan calmly laid down and dealt with the target's men who came rushing in. However, when he rushed into the room to check for any survivors, he found his own personal files clearly displayed on the desk. He immediately realized he had been set up and demanded answers from the man. The man only knew someone had paid to have Duncan assassinated but didn't know who the employer was. After getting no answers, Duncan shot the man dead and sent a photo of the body to Vivian, telling her he was willing to take the job and that she should send the $1 million deposit immediately. Vivian, not daring to waste time, quickly transferred the money. What she didn't expect was that after Duncan received the money, he immediately sent her the photo of the man and told her the job was done. He also instructed Vivian to transfer the remaining balance within a day. Vivian was caught off guard, and Duncan's next words made her even more anxious. Duncan bluntly stated that someone was trying to set him up and warned Vivian to stay out of it, or she'd know the consequences. Panicked, Vivian immediately went to Blood and warned him that he'd better pay Duncan, or they'd spend the rest of their lives in fear, always at risk of Duncan ending them with a bullet. Blood admitted he had underestimated Duncan and agreed to pay Duncan for now to keep him calm, but he still intended to take everything back. He planned to send a team of young hitmen from Hilton to take care of Duncan. Duncan returned to the small town and continued his peaceful life. Since the town wasn't very big, Duncan and Camille ran into each other quite often, though she was initially a bit nervous when she first saw him. She also figured out that Duncan had chopped the wood for her, and after running into each other a few times, they began to become familiar. They would often have meals together, chat, and talk about life and the future. It seemed that Duncan had developed some feelings for Camille, and he bought her a gift, a handgun. Later, when Duncan taught Camille how to use the gun, Camille seemed to remember something horrifying and began trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger and eventually threw the gun away, crying. It turned out that when Camille was 13, she had helped out as an assistant to Santa Claus at a library. One night, the man dressed as Santa, drunk, assaulted her. She had always wanted to get a gun, find the man again, force him to sit down, make him understand his crime, and then pull the trigger to end it all. Hearing this, Duncan was filled with fury. He imagined finding the man and torturing him with a hammer before ending his life to avenge Camille. Meanwhile, Hilda's team had begun their mission. They had forced Duncan's accountant to give them the detailed addresses of Duncan's properties. Since Duncan was cautious, they didn't get any other useful information. They started searching property by property, but to their disappointment, there was no trace of Duncan. The properties were either rented out, or squatters had moved in. Having found nothing, they began going through everything Duncan had left behind, and eventually, they found a clue: several bank statements showing $200,000 donations to a charity. The money had all come from a bank in a remote small town. Hilda immediately led her team to the town, and after a long journey, they found the bank and began watching it carefully. Meanwhile, Duncan, unaware of what was happening, was back in town, trying to pick out another gift for Camille after his failed attempt with the gun. But this small town is really tiny, with only a few shops, and Hilda's team quickly spotted Duncan and notified her. On the way back, the team pretended their car broke down, and Duncan stopped. From the rearview mirror, he saw the girl intentionally unzip her jacket, revealing her tempting figure. Duncan immediately became alert. Cindy claimed her car had broken down and that her phone was dead, suggesting she needed to go to Duncan's place to avoid the incoming snowstorm. Duncan was suspicious, but he wanted to see who had been plotting against him. Soon, Duncan brought Cindy to his home. After charging her phone, Cindy pretended to call a friend for help, only to receive the reply that the storm was too strong and they couldn't come until tomorrow. Cindy smoothly stayed the night at Duncan's, and as they prepared to rest, she made flirtatious remarks to provoke him. Duncan, of course, obliged. Outside, Hilda's team surrounded the house, with snipers positioned for long-range shots and Hilda leading a team to surround from both sides. When the sniper aimed at Duncan, his eyes weren't clouded by infatuation but waiting for something. As the sniper pulled the trigger, the bullet hit Cindy instead. Duncan seized the opportunity to evade and engaged in a gunfight with Hilda and her team, then decapitated the woman who had been reporting his location before disappearing without a trace. After the intruders came in, they lost track of Duncan, but the sniper quickly pinpointed his location. What they didn't know was that during that brief moment, Duncan had snuck up behind him and shot him dead. Duncan grabbed the sniper's equipment, shot up the lights in the house, and activated thermal vision. Hilda, realizing the situation, quickly tossed a flare to obscure her team's positions and had them flank Duncan, but Duncan, already aware, shot them from behind. As the flare burned out, Hilda hid behind the fridge to cover her body's heat signature, but the seasoned Duncan, knowing how to read breath patterns, pinpointed her location and shot her dead after 2 shots. After 2 attempted assassinations and the earpiece conversation with Hilda, Duncan was pretty sure the killers had been sent by the company. To confirm, he found a motel key on one of the assassins. He drove there and discovered a member of the team in the room. From her, he learned there was another member who had kidnapped Camille to use her as leverage against Duncan. In a panic, Duncan raced to Camille's house, only to find it in disarray. Camille had been kidnapped, and Blut, after hearing that Shell's team had failed to kill Duncan, was furious. He swore to do whatever it took to kill him. Meanwhile, Duncan tracked down an old retired friend and learned Blut's plan to seize the retirement funds. Duncan now understood why the company had ordered his assassination. His old friend also suspected Camille had been taken to the headquarters. Duncan's immediate goal was to rescue her. However, as he parted ways with his friend, he was betrayed and knocked unconscious by a drug. When Duncan woke up, he found himself hanging in the company's torture chamber. Blut blamed Duncan for Hilda's death and his own losses. With 4 days left until Duncan had to die, Blut planned to make him suffer before death. Blut showed Duncan pictures of Camille being tortured. For the next 3 days, Blut tortured Duncan with cruel, non-lethal methods, leaving him bruised and battered. By the 3rd day, when Blut stabbed Duncan with a knife, the blade broke off inside his flesh. In a fit of rage, Blut stabbed Duncan's eye, blinding him permanently, and the once feared killer lost an eye forever. After Blut left, Duncan painfully extracted the blade from his flesh and unlocked his chains. On the 4th day, when the door to the torture chamber opened, Duncan suddenly rose and killed several guards. Outside, Blut, hearing the screams, panicked. Duncan damaged the power supply, plunging the place into darkness. As the guards fled, Blut ordered them to kill Duncan, then ran away. But, as expected, none of the guards lasted long against Duncan. Some guards died, others fled. Duncan fought his way through, but due to his injuries and the unfavorable terrain, he was shot. Luckily, the wound wasn't fatal. In no time, the narrow corridor was littered with bodies, and Duncan, despite his injuries, managed to escape. He struggled to reach a trusted arms dealer. Knowing his escape might put Camille's life in danger, he immediately used his dealer's phone to call Vivian, offering his life in exchange for Camille's, then passed out. The next day, Duncan woke up with his wounds cleaned and bandaged, but the pain was unbearable. There was no time for recovery. At his request, the dealer supplied him with heavy weapons and high-tech laser targeting systems. Duncan drove off, calling Vivian on the way. After confirming Camille was still alive, he hung up. The call was traced to a general area. Despite this, Blut sent his elite team to search the area. Meanwhile, Duncan arrived at an abandoned factory and set up all his heavy weapons. Afterward, he called Vivian, setting the time and place for their deal. Vivian, trying to buy time, managed to track Duncan's precise location, but only after he'd set his trap. Just under a minute from their convoy, Vivian and her team surrounded Duncan. Blut, watching through the assassin's camera, thought Duncan was cornered. What they didn't realize was that Duncan had intentionally led them into a trap to eliminate Blut's elite team. Out of respect for their past, Duncan gave Vivian a chance to live. At that point, both Vivian and Blut thought Duncan was done for. When Vivian ordered his execution, she deeply regretted it. Within seconds, Blut's elite team was wiped out, leaving him stunned. As for Vivian, Duncan didn't finish her off, nor did he help her. He let her fend for herself. Soon, Duncan arrived at the headquarters. By then, Blut had very few people left. When the remaining staff saw Duncan, they were so terrified they dropped everything and fled, leaving Blut behind. Duncan faced no obstacles as he made his way through the building. Before entering Blut's office, he casually grabbed an axe. At that moment, Blut was still trying to make a phone call, ordering his men to bring Camille to him so he could use her to threaten Duncan. Unexpectedly, the subordinate refused Blut's orders. By then, Blut had been completely abandoned. Duncan was already standing behind him, and in the end, he decapitated Blut. Duncan then carried the unconscious Camille out of there. After a few days of rest, Camille slowly recovered. One day, Duncan found a bill for his donations on the bed, along with several briefings about a family being murdered, with only a little girl surviving. This was the very nightmare that had haunted Duncan for years. He realized that Camille was that surviving girl. When he turned around, Camille was pointing a gun at him. It turned out Camille had intentionally approached Duncan to exact revenge for the death of her family. Years ago, Duncan had received the wrong intelligence and mistakenly killed Camille's family. By the time he realized the mistake, it was too late, and the only survivor was Camille, who was just a little girl at the time. To make up for the mistake, Duncan had been donating $200,000 every year, and all of it had gone to Camille. Before moving here, Duncan had never met Camille, so as not to disturb her life. But no amount of money could bring back Camille's family or undo the torment she'd suffered over the years. Duncan understood this. If he were to die at Camille's hands, he would willingly accept it, hoping for an early release from his own guilt. After a gunshot rang out, both of them felt at peace. In the end, Camille couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. She asked Duncan if he knew who was responsible for her father's death. Duncan answered that he didn't, but he could find out. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.